The scent of stale coffee and forgotten files clung to Detective Miles Corbin like a second skin, a permanent perfume from a career spent chasing ghosts. At 58, with the finish line of retirement so close he could almost taste it, his world had shrunk to the four walls of the cold case division. His desk was an archaeological dig of manila folders, each one a monument to a life interrupted, a story without an ending. He moved with the slow, deliberate gait of a man who had seen too much and expected too little. His latest assignment felt more like custodial work than detective duty, a final procedural walkthrough of the condemned St. Jude's Home for Children, before the demolition crew turned its history into dust and rubble. Where are you reading us from? Share your city and country in the comments before we continue this story. The drive out of the city was a gradual descent into a different time. Paved highways gave way to cracked asphalt, which in turn surrendered to a gravel road swallowed by the colossal pines of rural Oregon. The forest pressed in on all sides, a dense, silent congregation of ancient trees that blotted out the sun and seemed to muffle the sounds of the modern world. Corbin switched off the radio, the silence that replaced it feeling heavier, more profound. He felt like an intruder here, a trespasser on land that had long ago decided to keep its secrets. The saint? Jude's legend was something he'd heard about his whole career, a local ghost story, a cautionary tale. But he'd never had a reason to venture this deep into its domain. When the orphanage finally emerged from the tree line, it was less a building and more a scar on the landscape. A Gothic monstrosity of dark stone and rotting timber, its skeletal frame was choked with decades of untamed ivy. Windows, like vacant eyes, were either boarded up or shattered, offering glimpses into the darkness within. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth, decaying leaves, and something else. A faint cloying sweetness like withered flowers. A rusted iron gate, half devoured by thorny vines, hung open on a single hinge, a silent, uninviting welcome. The place didn't just feel abandoned, it felt malevolent, as if the very ground it stood on held a grudge against the living. In the autumn of 1965, the silence within St. Jude's was of a different sort, not of emptiness, but of suppression. 34 children sat at long wooden tables in the cavernous dining hall, their movements synchronized and unnervingly quiet. The only sounds were the scrape of forks on ceramic plates and the rhythmic ticking of a grandfather clock in the corner. Headmistress Eleanor Vance stood motionless by the hearth, a severe figure in a high-collared dress, her gaze sweeping over the children, not with warmth, but with the focused intensity of a scientist observing an experiment. There were no whispers, no stolen glances, only a pervasive, disciplined order that felt as cold and unyielding as the stone walls surrounding them. Back in 2010, Corbin's heavy boots echoed through that same dining hall, each footstep disturbing a 45-year-old layer of dust. The scene was a haunting tableau of arrested time. Plates, some still holding the petrified remains of a final meal, sat on the tables. A small knitted sweater was draped over the back of a child-sized chair, as if its owner had only just stepped away. Sunlight struggled through a grime-caked window, illuminating swirling dust motes that danced like tiny ghosts in the stale air. Corbin ran a gloved hand over a table, the wood cold and lifeless. The official report called it a mass desertion, a clean bureaucratic term for an event that felt anything but. He moved from room to room, his flashlight beam cutting through the oppressive gloom. The dormitories were the most unsettling, with small, neatly made beds waiting for children who would never return. On one wall, a child's drawing of a stick-figure family was pinned, its colors faded to pale suggestions of what they once were. Corbin paused, his cynical exterior cracking for just a moment. He had always scoffed at the official explanation. How does an entire community of 39 people, most of them children, simply vanish into thin air without a single trace? It defied logic, it defied reason. It was a puzzle with all the pieces missing, and as he approached the heavy oak door of the headmistress's office, he felt a familiar, unwelcome pull. The hunt was beginning. The night of October 28, 1965, arrived not with a bang, but with a chilling, unnatural stillness. Outside, a storm gathered its breath, the wind whispering through the colossal pines like a nervous secret. Inside St. Jude's, the oppressive dinner-time silence was replaced by a new, more profound quiet, one of solemn anticipation. The children were not in the dining hall, but gathered in the main foyer, their small faces pale in the flickering lantern light. They stood in perfectly straight lines, their usual subdued energy now frozen into a state of statuesque apprehension. Headmistress Eleanor Vance stood before them, her silhouette, a sharp dark cutout, against the tall arched window where the first drops of rain began to streak the grimy glass. Eleanor Vance addressed the assembled children and staff, her voice not rising to command, but maintaining a low, hypnotic cadence that seemed to vibrate in the very stonework of the hall. She spoke not of punishment or chores, but of a great departure, a final protocol that would deliver them from the world's sorrows. Her words were abstract, filled with allusions to a new beginning and an ascension to a place of perfect order and peace. There was no warmth in her tone, only the unwavering certainty of a zealot delivering a long-rehearsed sermon. To the few adults present, her calm was more terrifying than any rage, a placid surface on a deep, dark ocean of fanaticism. From his place in the second row, 8-year-old Samuel clutched the small, hand-carved wooden bird hidden in his pocket until his knuckles turned white. It was the only thing he had left from his father. He didn't understand the headmistress's words about transcendence or shedding their worldly shells, but he understood the feeling coiling in his stomach. It was a cold, heavy dread, the same feeling he'd had the day the black car took his mother away. He watched Mrs. Vance's unblinking eyes and saw not a savior, but a final, inescapable authority. The other children were just as still, their learned obedience warring with a primal instinct to flee that had nowhere to go. The first step of the protocol was the removal of their identities. The children were led to the dormitories and instructed to change out of their worn gray uniforms into simple, identical white linen shifts. The fabric was coarse and cold against their skin, smelling faintly of lye and disuse. Each child, from the smallest 4-year-old to the oldest teenager, was rendered anonymous, a blank slate prepared for an unknown inscription. Their personal effects, a hidden photograph, a worn-out book, Samuel's wooden bird, were to be left behind on their neatly made beds. It was a systematic erasure of self, a chillingly efficient process that transformed a group of individuals into a single, unified entity ready for sacrifice. One of the younger staff members, a kind-hearted woman named Anna, who often slipped the children extra bread at dinner, hesitated for a moment. Her hands trembled as she helped a small girl with the buttons on her shift. Her eyes met Eleanor's from across the room, and in that shared glance a silent, desperate plea was made, and then ruthlessly denied. The headmistress's expression didn't change, but her gaze hardened with the immense pressure of her conviction, a look that promised severe consequences for any disruption to the grand design. Anna lowered her head, her brief spark of rebellion extinguished by the overwhelming force of Eleanor's will, and continued her task with mechanical compliance. The procession began. Led by Eleanor Vance, who held a single bright brass lantern, the 34 children and 4 staff members filed out of the dormitory. Their bare feet made soft, shuffling sounds on the cold stone floors, a ghostly whisper that replaced the grandfather clock's familiar tick. They moved not with the chaotic energy of children, but with the somber, practiced discipline of monks. The lanterns they carried cast long, dancing shadows on the walls, twisting their small forms into grotesque, elongated figures. The building itself seemed to be holding its breath, the familiar hallways and staircases now feeling like a tomb they were solemnly marching through on their way to be buried. They passed through the dining hall, a place of silent meals and constant scrutiny, now a silent witness to their exodus. The tables were set for a breakfast that would never be eaten, a detail of Eleanor's meticulous planning. The sight of it, the empty chairs, the neatly placed plates, the knitted sweater left behind, was a chilling portrait of lives about to be permanently interrupted. Samuel glanced at his designated seat, a place where he had spent hundreds of hours in quiet fear, and felt a strange, hollow pang of loss for even that miserable routine. The familiar world was being dismantled piece by piece, and he was being led away into an incomprehensible new reality he did not ask for. The heavy oak doors groaned open, admitting a blast of cold, rain-soaked air that smelled of wet earth and pine. The children flinched, but no one broke rank. They stepped out into the inky blackness of the Oregon night, the forest surrounding St. Jude's a solid wall of impenetrable shadow. The storm had fully arrived, and the wind howled a mournful dirge through the trees, whipping the thin linen shifts against their shivering bodies. The world they knew had been reduced to the small, fragile pools of light cast by their lanterns, a tiny archipelago of flickering hope in an ocean of overwhelming darkness. Eleanor stood at the head of the line, her face serene, untouched by the tempest. She led them away from the main path and onto a barely visible trail that snaked deep into the ancient woods. The ground was slick with mud and tangled with roots that seemed to grab at their ankles. But Eleanor moved with an unnerving grace and purpose, her lantern held high like a beacon. She never looked back, her faith in her followers' obedience absolute. The children followed, their fear a palpable thing that hung in the air between them. They were a silent, white-robed column of ghosts, drifting through a hostile landscape, their destination known only to the woman who was leading them further and further away from any chance of rescue or return. The discipline that had been ingrained in them for years was the only thing holding them together. A small girl near the back began to cry, her sobs quickly muffled by the hand of an older boy. Another child stumbled and was instantly pulled back to his feet by the staff member behind him. They were a single organism, moving as one, their individual fears suppressed for the sake of the whole. Samuel's heart hammered against his ribs, each beat a frantic drum signaling his terror. He focused on the small light of the lantern in front of him, a tiny point of reference in the swirling chaos of wind, rain, and absolute darkness. They finally reached a small circular clearing, unnaturally barren in the heart of the dense forest. The rain seemed to lessen here, and the wind died down to an expectant whisper. Eleanor stopped and turned to face them, her eyes gleaming with a fervent, ecstatic light. She raised her free hand, not in a gesture of comfort, but of presentation. A low, resonant hum began to emanate from the ground beneath their feet, a vibration that was felt more than heard. Through the thick canopy of trees, a faint pulsing light of no discernible color began to filter down, bathing the clearing in an ethereal, otherworldly glow that made the children's white shifts appear luminous. Samuel looked up, his face a mask of awe and terror. The humming grew louder, the light brighter, seeming to press down on them. Eleanor Vance began to speak, her voice now filled with a triumphant, ringing emotion, as she welcomed their saviors. Her words were lost in the rising thrum that vibrated through Samuel's bones. He saw the faces of the other children, all turned upward, their expressions mirroring his own. Then, the next morning, the sun rose on a perfectly silent St. Jude's home for children. The rain had washed the world clean, but inside, the dining hall remained a static, haunting museum of an aborted breakfast, a monument to the 39 souls who had vanished into the Oregon night. The initial investigation in the winter of 1965 was a study in futility, a desperate search swallowed by the vast, indifferent Oregon wilderness. State police, aided by local volunteers, combed the forest for weeks, their hopeful shouts absorbed by the dense canopy of pines. They found nothing. No footprints, no scraps of clothing, no sign of a struggle. Within a year, the official conclusion was logged in a thin, unsatisfying file. Mass desertion. It was a tidy, bureaucratic explanation for an event that defied all logic. With no families to press for answers, the children of St. Jude's were, after all, wards of a state that had already forgotten them. The case grew cold with the speed of an Oregon winter, its urgency fading into a quiet, collective shrug. As the 1960s bled into the 1970s, St. Jude's began its slow transformation from a crime scene into a local legend. The windows were boarded up, a chain and padlock were slung across the rusted gates, and the town did its best to forget. But for a handful of people, forgetting was impossible. One of them was Deputy Frank Miller, a young officer on the initial search team. For years, the image of the untouched breakfast in the dining hall haunted his sleep. He would unofficially revisit the case file annually, poring over the same sparse details, the same black and white photos of children with solemn eyes. He felt a profound sense of failure, a nagging certainty that the truth was not in the file, but still breathing somewhere within those decaying stone walls. In a small house on the edge of town, a young woman named Martha was tormented by a different kind of memory. As a girl, she had lived on a farm bordering the St. Jude's property. For years, she had carried a fragmented image from the night of the storm, a silent procession of small white figures moving through the trees, each holding a flickering light. Her parents had dismissed it as a nightmare, a child's fantasy born from the howl of the wind. She tried to believe them, pushing the vision down into the deep well of things best left unexamined. But the memory persisted, a sliver of glass in her mind, and the fear of being labeled a fool warred constantly with the terrifying possibility that what she saw was real. By the 1980s, the tragedy of St. Jude's had been fully supplanted by its ghost story. It became a rite of passage for local teenagers to sneak onto the property, daring each other to touch the cold stone of the main building, their nervous laughter echoing in the oppressive silence. The narrative had shifted from a search for the lost to a tale of the haunted. Anniversary articles in the local paper grew shorter each year, rehashing the same few known facts before concluding with the official mass desertion theory. The disappearance was no longer an open wound, but a faded historical scar, a piece of macabre folklore that defined the town's darker edges while keeping the uncomfortable truth at a safe distance. For Frank Miller, now a grizzled detective nearing his own retirement, the case remained a raw, unhealed injury. The passage of time did not bring peace, only a deeper, more entrenched frustration. He'd spent countless nights in his study, the children's intake photos pinned to a corkboard, their faces a silent jury to his decades of failure. He imagined their lives, their fears, their last moments under the unyielding gaze of Eleanor Vance. His obsession became a quiet burden, isolating him from colleagues who saw the case as a professional dead end. He was a man chasing ghosts, and the weight of their 39 silent screams was a cross he carried alone, growing heavier with each passing year of unanswered questions. In the early 1990s, a rookie detective named Miles Corbin was assigned to the county precinct. During a tedious inventory of the cold case archives, he stumbled upon the St. Jude's file. The box was thick with dust, its contents brittle with age. He read the summary, the witness statements that led nowhere, the frustrating conclusion. His superiors waved it off as the town's boogeyman story, a waste of time and resources. Yet for Corbin, the sheer impossibility of it was captivating. How could so many people, especially children, simply cease to exist? The file was closed, but for Corbin, a door had been opened to a mystery that would lie dormant in the back of his mind for years to come. Meanwhile, Martha, now a grandmother, found that age was not a balm for her memory, but a lens that brought it into sharper focus. The fragmented images of her childhood coalesced into a single, terrifyingly vivid recollection. She could feel the damp chill of the October air, smell the wet pine needles, and see the unnatural, orderly calm of the children as they followed Eleanor Vance into the woods. The memory was no longer a dream. It was a truth she had suppressed for decades. The silence of the children was the most haunting detail, a complete absence of childish chatter or complaint, replaced by a disciplined, somber obedience that felt profoundly, horrifyingly wrong, and her guilt over her own silence became a constant, aching presence. The orphanage itself became a monument to decay, a physical embodiment of the town's willful amnesia. The forest, patient and relentless, began its work of reclamation. Thick ivy, like gnarled green fingers, prized stones from the walls and shattered the remaining panes of glass. The roof sagged in the middle, creating a gaping maw that allowed rain and snow to rot the structure from within. Animals made their homes in the silent dormitories. The building was no longer just abandoned. It was being digested by the wilderness, its secrets being pulled deeper into the earth with each passing season, a slow, organic burial that mirrored the fading of its story from the world of the living. Over 4.5 decades, a conspiracy of silence, built from fear and practicality, settled over the town. The disappearance became an inconvenient truth, a story with no heroes and no resolution, and so it was gradually edited out of the town's official history. New families moved in, buying property and starting businesses, utterly unaware of the profound tragedy that had unfolded just a few miles down a forgotten gravel road, the story of the lost children of St. Jude's was relegated to the whispers of the old-timers, a cautionary tale that served only to remind them that some questions were better left unasked and some doors were better left sealed shut forever. Detective Frank Miller passed away in 2007, a quiet death that went largely unnoticed. His daughter, cleaning out his home, found a room filled with meticulously organized binders and maps, all dedicated to the St. Jude's case. It was a lifetime of unofficial work, a testament to a singular, unwavering obsession. Not knowing what else to do, she boxed it all up and dropped it off at the county archives, where it was filed away without ceremony. With Miller's death, the last active champion for the vanished children was gone. The torch of inquiry had been extinguished, leaving the mystery to languish in the darkness of a forgotten storage room, its final hope seemingly buried with him. In the years that followed, the St. Jude's property became a legal and financial quagmire. It was sold at auction multiple times, but every prospective developer was eventually scared away, either by the exorbitant cost of clearing the land or by the persistent, chilling local legends. Surveyors reported strange equipment malfunctions, and construction workers spoke of an unnerving feeling of being watched from the vacant, black windows of the main building. The place had developed its own immune system, a malevolent aura that actively repelled any attempt to disturb its long slumber, ensuring that its secrets remained untouched by the encroaching modern world. A year before the demolition was scheduled, Martha, her hands trembling with age and conviction, finally walked into the county sheriff's office. She sat across from a young, impatient deputy and recounted the story she had held inside for 44 years. She spoke of the white shifts, the lanterns, the silent procession into the stormy woods. The deputy typed dutifully, his expression a mixture of pity and boredom. Her statement was filed under unsubstantiated claims and placed in the St. Jude's cold case box, another piece of paper added to the pile. Her one act of courage was dismissed as the fantasy of an elderly woman, a final heartbreaking failure to make the world listen. The final decision came from the county board in 2009. Saint-Tropez. Jude's home for children was officially condemned. The structure was deemed a public hazard, a blight on the landscape. The order for its demolition was signed, and a date was set for the following year. For the town, it was the final chapter in a long and unsettling story, a chance to finally bulldoze the past and build something new. The demolition was not just about removing a dangerous building. It was a collective, bureaucratic effort to perform an exorcism, to erase the physical reminder of a mystery they had long ago decided was unsolvable and best forgotten. This was the legacy of silence and decay that Detective Miles Corbin inherited in the autumn of 2010. He wasn't just stepping into an abandoned building, he was stepping into the vacuum left by 45 years of fear, frustration, and forgotten duty. The dust that coated every surface was the physical manifestation of that long gap in time. The ghosts of St. Jude's were not just the spirits of the lost, but the echoes of failed investigations, suppressed memories, and the crushing weight of questions that had been allowed to fester in the dark for nearly half a century. His final procedural walkthrough was meant to be the epilogue, but the house was waiting to tell him the story from the very beginning. Detective Miles Corbin stood in the head mistress's office, the final room on his checklist. The air was heavy with the scent of decaying paper and regret. He was about to close the file, both literally and figuratively, when he stumbled against a massive steel filing cabinet shoved into a corner. It didn't budge, not an inch. A flicker of professional curiosity, an instinct he thought had died years ago, sparked to life. The cabinet was an immovable object in a room full of decay, an anchor holding the room to a secret. He ran his gloved hand along its side, feeling the cold, unyielding metal, and noticed deep, ancient scratches on the floorboards around its base, as if it were guarding something. Summoning the last reserves of his energy, Corbin put his shoulder into the cabinet. The metal groaned in protest, a sound that ripped through the 45 years of silence. With a final agonizing heave that sent a jolt of pain through his lower back, the cabinet scraped a few inches across the floor. The sound was deafening, a shriek of metal on wood that echoed through the empty orphanage. He peered into the space it had occupied, and his heart hammered against his ribs. There, outlined in the thick dust, was a perfect rectangle. The floorboards had been cut. A recessed, rusted iron ring lay flush with the wood, a secret handle to a door that had no right to be there. The weariness of the day, of his entire career, evaporated in a rush of pure adrenaline. This was it. This was the anomaly, the piece that never fit. The building's original schematics, which he had reviewed just last week, showed nothing below this office but solid foundation. This hatch was an addition, a deliberate clandestine modification. He knelt, his knees cracking, and pulled at the ring. It was frozen solid with rust and time. He felt a surge of desperate urgency, a primal need to see what lay beneath. The ghosts of St. Jude's, long dormant, were whispering, and for the first time in decades, someone was finally close enough to hear what they had to say. He retrieved a crowbar from his patrol car, the walk back through the silent halls feeling different now, charged with a new and terrifying energy. He wedged the tip of the crowbar under the edge of the hatch and threw his full weight onto it. The wood groaned, then splintered. He worked with a frantic intensity, the screech of protesting metal and the crack of old wood filling the office. With a final, explosive bang, the rusted bolts gave way, and the hatch shuddered loose. He stood back, breathing heavily, his chest tight with a mixture of fear and vindication. The silence that followed was heavier now, pregnant with the unknown that lay just inches beneath his feet. He gripped the iron ring with both hands and lifted. The heavy wooden door swung upward, releasing a blast of cold subterranean air. It was a smell unlike any other he had encountered, a cloying mixture of damp earth, ozone, and a faint antiseptic chemical odor that pricked at his nostrils. It was the smell of a sealed tomb, of a place where time had not just stopped but had been deliberately murdered and buried. He shone his flashlight into the opening, but the beam was swallowed by an absolute, impenetrable darkness. It wasn't just an absence of light. It felt like a physical presence, a void that was actively pulling the world into it. His hand trembled slightly as he keyed his radio. "Dispatch, this is Corbin at the St. Jude site. I've found an undocumented subterranean level in the West Wing office. I'm going to need forensics and a structural engineer out here. I'm proceeding with initial entry. Advise caution." The dispatcher's tinny, routine acknowledgement was a fragile link to a world that suddenly felt a million miles away. He holstered his radio, took a deep breath of the stale office air, and swung his legs over the edge, his boots finding the top rung of a steep, narrow stone staircase that descended into the suffocating blackness below, each step taking him further from the known world. The descent was unnerving. The stone steps were slick with a thin film of moisture, and the concrete walls on either side were cold and unnaturally smooth, a stark contrast to the Gothic stonework of the orphanage above. It felt like entering a different structure entirely, a secret building hidden within the shell of the old one. His flashlight beam cut a nervous path ahead, revealing a small, square room at the bottom. As he reached the floor, he swept the light from left to right, his mind struggling to process the scene that materialized from the darkness. It was not a cellar filled with junk or a forgotten pantry. It was a laboratory, a prison. Along the far wall, arranged in a chillingly precise line, were 34 small metal-framed cots. They were bare, stripped of any bedding, their surfaces gleaming faintly in the beam of his light. Above each cot, a number from 1 to 34 had been stenciled in stark black paint directly onto the concrete. The sight was horrifying in its order and its implication. This wasn't a dormitory, it was a holding cell, a place of clinical observation. This was where the children were kept. He felt a cold dread seep into his bones, a certainty that he had stumbled upon a truth far more sinister than a simple case of mass desertion. His beam then moved to the adjacent wall, revealing a massive chalkboard nearly 20 feet long, bolted directly to the concrete. It was covered from end to end with a frantic, chaotic scrawl of writing. He stepped closer, the light illuminating a bewildering collage of complex astronomical charts, intricate geometric patterns he didn't recognize, and rows of cryptic equations. Interspersed between the scientific notations were unsettling drawings of elongated, non-human figures with large dark eyes. It was the work of a brilliant, obsessive, and dangerously unhinged mind. This was Eleanor Vance's true office, her secret sanctuary of fanaticism, hidden beneath the floorboards of her public life. Corbin felt a profound sense of disorientation, as if the very laws of reality were warping in this hidden room. The official narrative of a stern but pious headmistress running a simple orphanage was a lie, a carefully constructed facade to hide this chamber of horrors. What kind of experiment was being conducted down here? What was the purpose of these equations and strange celestial maps? The questions multiplied, each one darker than the last. He was no longer a detective walking through a condemned building. He was an archaeologist who had just broken the seal on a pharaoh's cursed tomb, and the air was thick with the weight of an ancient, terrible secret. As he slowly backed away from the chalkboard, his light drifted across the floor, catching on a small object lying in the dust next to the cot marked with the number 34. He crouched, his joints protesting, and reached for it. His glove closed around a small, smooth piece of wood. He brought it up to the light, his breath catching in his throat. It was a bird, hand-carved with a child's earnest imperfection, its wings spread as if in mid-flight. The wood was dark and polished smooth from the constant touch of a small, anxious hand. In that moment, the 34 numbered cots ceased to be a statistic. They became children. Holding the small wooden bird, the entire 45-year-old mystery collapsed into a single, devastating point of emotional gravity. This tiny artifact was a testament to a life, a name, a soul that had been erased. It was a final desperate message sent across a chasm of nearly half a century. A boy, Samuel, had stood in this cold, sterile room, clutching this one connection to his past, before being led into an unimaginable fate. The weight of it all, the silence, the forgotten names, the town's willful amnesia, crashed down on Miles Corbin. The hunt wasn't just beginning, it was his now. He owed them an ending to their story. The arrival of the forensics team shattered the tomb-like silence of St. Jude's with the mundane sounds of a modern investigation, the crackle of radios, the zip of evidence bags, and the methodical hum of portable generators. They descended into the hidden chamber like soldiers entering an alien world, their sterile white suits a stark contrast to the oppressive, ancient darkness. Detective Santiago, Corbin's younger, tech-savvy partner, stood at the top of the stairs, his face a mask of professional detachment. He saw a crime scene, a puzzle of logistics and procedure. Corbin, however, remained at the bottom, the small wooden bird, a heavy, sacred weight in his palm. He wasn't just in a basement. He was standing in the heart of a 45-year-old wound, and he could feel its phantom ache. The initial sweep of the subterranean room yielded more questions than answers, deepening the enigma with every sterile swab and photograph. The forensics report was a study in contradictions. The room was unnaturally clean, devoid of the expected layers of dust and decay. There were no significant DNA traces, no fingerprints other than Corbin's, and absolutely no signs of violence or struggle. It was as if the 34 children and their keepers had been present one moment and had simply dematerialized the next, leaving behind a perfectly preserved, sterile environment. This clinical absence of evidence was more chilling than any bloodstain. It hinted at a departure that was meticulously planned and executed with an unnatural, almost supernatural precision. Corbin found himself locked in a silent battle with his own department's pragmatism, embodied by the skeptical Detective Santiago. "Look, Miles," Santiago argued, his voice echoing in the cavernous dining hall above, "it's a cult. Vance was a charismatic nutjob who built a bunker, convinced them all to drink the Kool-Aid, and buried the body somewhere out there." He gestured vaguely toward the immense forest. But Corbin couldn't shake the feeling that it was something else, something stranger. The cold equations on the board and the pristine condition of the room didn't speak of a chaotic mass suicide. They spoke of a procedure, a successful experiment. The wooden bird in his pocket felt like a silent rebuttal to Santiago's easy answers. Experts were brought in to analyze the cryptic chalkboard, and their collective confusion only amplified the mystery. A renowned astrophysicist from Portland State University confirmed that some of the charts depicted known celestial alignments, but they were interspersed with constellations that didn't exist, and orbital mechanics that defied the laws of physics. A cryptographer spent 2 days staring at the equations, finally concluding they were part of a logical system of mathematics, but one with no known terrestrial origin. It was a complete, coherent language of science from a place unknown. The chalkboard was not the ramblings of a madwoman. It was a precise and complex instruction manual for a journey to an impossible destination. Frustrated, Corbin turned his focus to the architect of this mystery, Eleanor Vance. He spent days buried in the county archives, sifting through brittle, yellowed documents, but her life was a fortress of missing information. Her academic records showed a genius-level intellect, with doctorates in both abnormal psychology and theoretical astronomy, a bizarre and unsettling combination. Yet, after a brilliant early career, she had vanished from the academic world, only to resurface years later as the headmistress of a remote orphanage for forgotten children. It was a deliberate retreat from the world, a calculated move into seclusion where she could conduct her work, undisturbed and unobserved, with a captive and vulnerable audience. The story inevitably broke, leaking from the department and exploding across the state. "Secret chamber found in Orphanage of the Vanished," screamed the headlines. The media descended on the small town like a flock of vultures, their satellite trucks lining the gravel road to St. Jude's. The sudden, intense spotlight put immense pressure on Corbin's superiors, who were desperate for a narrative they could sell to the public. A murder-suicide cult was tragic but understandable. Corbin's quiet insistence that the evidence didn't fit was seen not as due diligence, but as the stubborn fixation of an old cop chasing phantoms on the verge of retirement, an obstacle to a swift and tidy resolution. It was one of those sensational news reports that finally reached Martha, now 86, in her quiet room at a nursing home. The mention of St. Jude's and a secret discovery jolted a memory she had spent a lifetime trying to bury under the weight of denial. The image of the silent, white-robed children moving through the trees under the stormy sky returned with the force of a physical blow. It was not a dream. She knew it with a certainty that rattled her old bones. Her past failure to speak up, her fear of being dismissed as a hysterical child, was a guilt that had festered for decades. With trembling hands, she picked up the phone and called the sheriff's department, her voice weak but resolute. Corbin took the call himself, driving out to the nursing home with low expectations. He had fielded dozens of calls from psychics and conspiracy theorists since the story broke. But as Martha spoke, his cynicism began to dissolve. She didn't offer wild theories, she offered sensory details. She described the unnatural silence of the children, the way they moved as one, and the eerie, pulsing light she saw in the clearing deep within the woods, a detail she had never told anyone. "They weren't running away, detective," she whispered, her eyes filled with a 45-year-old terror. "They were being led, like lambs, and they never made a sound, not a single one." Santiago predictably dismissed the testimony as contaminated and unreliable. An 86-year-old woman's memory from when she was a kid? After seeing it on TV, it's worthless in court, Miles. It's just noise. The argument between them in the car back to the station was heated, a clash of two different generations of police work. Santiago trusted data, hard evidence, and clear motives. Corbin, however, was beginning to understand that this case operated on a different kind of logic. He was investigating a belief system, a faith, and Martha's testimony, however flawed, was the first piece of evidence that spoke to the human experience of that terrible night. The breakthrough came from the most unexpected of places. A junior forensics technician, conducting a final meticulous scan of the items from the basement, noticed a slight weight imbalance in the metal cot marked 34. Following a hunch, she dismantled it. Tucked deep inside one of the hollow steel legs, sealed against the damp air, was a small, tightly rolled cylinder of paper. It had been deliberately hidden, a tiny message in a bottle, cast into an ocean of time. The lab called Corbin immediately. The silence in the room was absolute as he watched the technician carefully unroll the brittle, fragile document under a magnifying lamp, his heart pounding with a mixture of hope and dread. The paper wasn't a letter or a diary entry. It was a child's drawing rendered in wax crayon. On the left side of the page, a group of small white stick figures stood looking up. On the right, descending from a sky filled with strange, swirling stars, were the same tall, elongated figures with large, dark eyes that had been scrawled on the chalkboard. They weren't menacing, they were simply arriving. And at the bottom of the page, in the shaky, earnest print of a young boy, was a single name: Samuel. It was the final, heartbreaking piece of the puzzle, a child's interpretation of Eleanor Vance's great departure. It was a portrait of his own abduction, drawn as an act of salvation. Holding the drawing, Corbin felt an almost unbearable wave of empathy and rage. This was Samuel's testimony. This was the voice from the tomb. He now had the bird, the hidden drawing, and the name. The abstract horror of 34 vanished children coalesced into the tangible tragedy of one small boy who, in his final moments, tried to make sense of an incomprehensible fate. This was no longer just a case for Miles Corbin. It had become a personal crusade. He was Samuel's last witness, the sole inheritor of his story, and he felt a crushing responsibility to see it through to whatever terrifying end it might lead. This new personal conviction drove him back to the archives, specifically to the boxes of unofficial research left behind by the late Detective Frank Miller. For the first time, Corbin didn't see the ramblings of a failed, obsessed cop. He saw a kindred spirit. Miller had been on the right path all along. Buried in a dusty binder were copies of letters Miller had uncovered, correspondence between Eleanor Vance and fringe scientific groups in the early 1960s. They discussed non-terrestrial communication, celestial doorways, and the untapped psychic potential of the pre-adolescent mind. Miller had seen the truth, but no one had been willing to listen. The clock was ticking. The police chief, under pressure from the county to resolve the media circus, gave Corbin an ultimatum. "You have 48 hours to give me a plausible theory, Miles, something I can take to the press. A cult, a secret society, I don't care. But if you come to me with talk of aliens and star charts, I'm closing this for good as a murder-suicide." Corbin was now in a desperate race against institutional disbelief. He had all the pieces: a fanatic's mad science, an old woman's haunted memory, a dead detective's prescient notes, and a little boy's drawing of his own ascension. The truth was there, but it was a truth the world was not ready to hear. With the chief's 48-hour ultimatum hanging over him like a guillotine, Corbin felt the walls of the investigation closing in. He stood once more in the sterile subterranean chamber, the chaotic scrawl on the chalkboard mocking him with its silent alien logic. Santiago was upstairs, finalizing a report that would frame Eleanor Vance as a manipulative cult leader, a neat and tidy box for an impossibly messy truth. But Corbin couldn't let it go. His eyes scanned the equations, the non-existent constellations, the drawings of the elongated figures. He pulled out Frank Miller's old notes, a binder filled with decades of obsessive research. Miller had cross-referenced Vance's known academic papers with obscure astronomical events. Corbin's fingers traced a line from one of Miller's notations to a complex diagram on the board. It wasn't just a star chart, it was a map and a timetable. A jolt of adrenaline, cold and sharp, shot through him. The equations weren't just theoretical, they were navigational. They described a convergence of gravitational and electromagnetic fields, pinpointing a specific set of geographic coordinates deep in the forest, and a specific time, 10:28 p.m. on October 28, 1965. The night of the storm, the night they vanished. "Santiago," he yelled, his voice echoing up the stone staircase. "Get down here. It's not just a chart, it's a destination." Santiago appeared at the top of the stairs, his expression weary. "Miles, it's over. We have a solid theory." Corbin pointed a trembling finger at the board. "No, we have an assumption." She wasn't just talking to them. She was telling them exactly where and when to show up. "We need to go there. Now." The drive into the forest was a tense, silent battle of wills. Santiago drove the SUV with a grim resignation, clearly humoring the old detective on one last wild goose chase. Corbin, meanwhile, navigated using a handheld GPS, its modern sterile display a strange interface for the ancient cryptic map he held in his mind. The coordinates led them off the main road, down a barely there logging trail, and finally forced them to continue on foot. They pushed through dense, wet undergrowth, the colossal pines forming a cathedral-like canopy that blocked out the afternoon sun. As they drew closer to the location, Corbin felt a strange, low-level hum in the air, a faint vibration that seemed to resonate in his teeth, just as Martha had described. They broke through a final wall of ferns and stepped into a place that felt profoundly wrong. It was a perfectly circular clearing, about 50 feet in diameter, where nothing grew. The forest floor, rich with moss and life just inches away, stopped at a precise, unwavering line, giving way to a circle of barren, compacted earth. The air was still and cold. In the exact center of the clearing, a patch of ground, roughly 10 feet across, was different. It wasn't soil. It was a dark, glassy, obsidian-like substance, fractured into 1,000 tiny fissures, as if the very earth had been superheated and then instantly cooled. It was vitrified. Santiago stopped dead, his skepticism evaporating in a visible wave of shock and disbelief. "My God," he whispered, "what is this?" Corbin knelt, his gloved hand hovering over the strange, glassy surface. He could feel a faint, residual warmth emanating from it, an impossible heat that had lingered for 45 years. He understood now. This was the spot. This was where the great departure had taken place. Eleanor Vance's equations, her charts, her fanatical belief, it had all led here. It had all worked. This was not a grave. It was a launch pad, a docking bay. He looked up at the circle of silent, ancient trees that had borne witness to the event, their branches like the skeletal fingers of forgotten sentinels. The humming was slightly louder here, a permanent echo of an impossible energy, a scar left on the very fabric of the world. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the small, hand-carved wooden bird. The smooth, worn wood felt solid and real in a place where reality itself seemed thin and breakable. He thought of Samuel, a small boy in a white shift, standing on this very spot, clutching this same object. He would have looked up, not in terror, but in the conditioned awe his headmistress had promised him, as a light pulsed from the sky and a low hum vibrated through his bones. The profound tragedy of it all crashed down on Corbin, not of a murder, but of a theft. 39 lives hadn't been ended. They had been taken. They had been harvested. The catharsis was agonizing, a wave of understanding so vast and terrible it brought tears to his eyes. Santiago finally found his voice, a choked, disbelieving whisper. "We can't report this. No one will ever believe this. What do we even call it?" He looked at Corbin, his professional world shattered, seeking guidance from the man he had dismissed as a relic. Corbin stood up, his face etched with a terrible certainty, and placed the wooden bird in the center of the vitrified patch of ground. It was a grave marker for a boy with no grave, a final silent testament. "We call it the truth," Corbin said, his voice heavy with the weight of the 45-year-old secret. He had found the end of the story. But now, standing in this impossible clearing, he was faced with a new, terrifying beginning, how to tell a story that no one in the world was ready to hear. They called him a fool, an old man lost in the ghosts of a forgotten case. But he had found it, the truth, a truth so vast and terrifying it threatened to break the very foundations of the world he knew. I was called useless, abandoned by the one I loved most. How do you think I felt? What would you do if you were in my place, holding a piece of a puzzle that didn't belong to this earth? Would you choose the comfortable lie the world needs, or the devastating truth that would leave you utterly alone? Tell me, where are you listening to this story from? I need to know I'm not alone in this. The drive back from the clearing was a journey through a new, fractured reality. Santiago gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white, the pragmatic shell of the modern detective shattered into a million pieces. "We can't," he kept whispering, not to Corbin but to himself. "We just can't." In the end they made a silent pact, a conspiracy born of necessity and terror. Corbin's final report was a masterpiece of fiction, a plausible and tragic narrative that the world could accept. He wrote of Eleanor Vance, a charismatic cult leader whose messianic delusions led her followers into the unforgiving Oregon wilderness. He described a mass ritual suicide, the 39 souls lost to the storm, their bodies never recovered, claimed by the vast indifferent forest. It was a clean, brutal, and utterly believable lie. Months later, the last remnants of St. Jude's home for children were gone, replaced by a smooth, grassy field and a simple granite monument bearing 39 names. Miles Corbin attended his own retirement party, accepted the gold watch, and shook the hands of colleagues who praised him for finally closing the unclosable case. But the man who walked out of the precinct for the last time was a stranger to the one who had walked in. The weary cynicism had been burned away, replaced by a profound and heavy knowing. He often drove out to the monument, standing not as a cop who solved a crime, but as a secret keeper, the sole mourner at a grave for travelers who had left the world behind. Detective Santiago was never the same. The case that he had once dismissed as an old man's folly became the defining moment of his life, a secret he now shared with Corbin. He saw the world through a new lens, one tinted with the impossible. His work on other cases felt small, terrestrial, grounded in motives he could understand. But at night, he would sometimes pull the file, looking at the high-resolution photograph of Samuel's crayon drawing, a piece of evidence officially logged as victim's delusional artwork. It was a constant, terrifying reminder that the universe was infinitely larger and stranger than he had ever imagined, and that he was one of only 2 men left on Earth who knew it for a fact. For the town, the story was finally over. The ghost that had haunted its periphery for nearly half a century had been given a name and a motive. The legend of St. Jude's became a cautionary tale of fanaticism, a dark chapter neatly closed. But for Miles Corbin, the silence of the night sky was no longer empty. He would sit on his porch, looking up past the familiar constellations, his gaze searching the infinite blackness. He was no longer looking for answers, but for a sign, a faint flicker from a place he couldn't name. He was a watchman on a wall no one else could see, standing guard over a memory that was not his own, bound by a silent promise to a boy named Samuel. The truth of what happened on that stormy October night in 1965 was never recorded in any official document. It exists now only in the shared silence between 2 men, in the vitrified earth of a hidden clearing, and in the form of a small hand-carved bird resting in a place that has no name. The final question was never answered, left to echo in the vast emptiness between the stars. Was it a rescue or an abduction, an ascension or a harvest? The story of St. Jude's became a permanent scar on reality, a testament to the idea that some mysteries are not meant to be solved, but only to be witnessed, leaving behind a faint, persistent hum just at the edge of human understanding.